Once you've inserted data into a database table, the next thing you normally want to do is to retrieve and display the data. I'm working in a new version of the project named Retrieve Data, and I've refactored the code a bit. I used to have all the code to insert data in the main activity class. I've moved that code into the data source class into a method named seedDatabase. It's exactly the same code as before. It checks to see whether there's any data in the database table, and if not, it adds all that data in. And this method is now called from the main activities onCreate method right after instantiating the data source class. Now that I've stored the data in the database, I now want to retrieve the data from the database for display instead of using the original sample data. In order to retrieve data, you could use a raw SQL statement, but as I described previously, that would involve a lot of code, and many times you can use the convenience methods of the database class to do the work for you, and that's what I'm going to do here. I'll start in my table class, which I named Items Table, and I'm going to add a new constant here. It'll be an array of strings, and each item in the array will be one of the names of the columns of the table. I'll start off with public, static, and final, and I'll declare this as a string array. I'll name it all columns. Then I'll list each of the columns in turn. I'll just copy and paste them, separating them with commas. I'll take the column name, the column description, category, position, price, and image. I'll copy and paste one column, and then I'll modify them as needed. And I'll add an align feed to make it more readable. The order in which you declare the column names will determine the order of columns when you return data from the database. But as I'll show you when I actually retrieve the data, the positions of the columns won't really matter. Next, I'll create a new method in my data source class that uses that string array. I'll name it getAllItems, and it'll return a list of data item objects. It'll be public, so it can be called from anywhere in the application, and it'll start by declaring an array list. I'll set its type as list containing data item objects. I'll name it data items, and I'll instantiate it with the concrete array list constructor. Then, to eliminate any initial errors, I'll just return the data items list. But I'll leave a little bit of space in the middle, where I'll do the work of retrieving the data. In order to retrieve data, the simplest method to use is called query, and it's a member of the database object. I've already declared my database object as a field of this class, so I can call mdatabase.query. There are a number of different versions of this method. I'm going to use the third version, and I'm going to pass in the name of the table and the string array of column names. I'll start off with itemstable.tableItems, and then I'll pass in itemstable.allColumns. And then I'll pass in 5 values of null. I'm not going to worry about filtering and sorting quite yet. The query method returns an instance of the cursor class from android.database. So I'll prefix the call like this, cursor equals. And now I'm getting back a cursor object that I can use to traverse the data set. If you're familiar with JDBC programming in Java, the cursor class is similar to the result set class. It's a reference to the data that's returned from the query. In a Java result set, the cursor starts before the first row, and the same thing is true of the SQLite cursor object in Android. So I'm going to use a while loop here, and my condition will be cursor.moveToNext. Notice that there's a move to first, a move to last, a move to next, and a move to position. The move to next method returns a Boolean value. If it succeeds in moving to a valid row of data, it'll return true. Otherwise, it'll return false, and you'll exit the loop. Within the loop, I'll create a data item object, and I'll use the noArguments constructor of my class. Now, I'll show you the basic code you're going to use for each column. You'll start by referencing the item object. Then you'll call the setter method for one of the fields. I'll set the item ID. Then you need to pass in either the name or the position of the column where the data is stored. As I mentioned previously, we know the order of the columns because we declared them in the all columns array, but instead of doing that, you should always use this bit of code where you pass in the name of the column. Start off with cursor.get and then the type of the data you're retrieving. In my table, the item ID is a string, so I'm calling getString. Then pass in the method cursor.getColumnIndex like this. And then finally pass in the name of the column, which I have as a constant in itemstable.columnID. And you'll do this for each and every column. Now, because there's quite a bit of typing to do, I have a gist that I've prepared, and it has a short URL of git.io/v, uppercase P, lowercase s, then the number 97. And I'll select all of this code and copy it, and I'm going to paste it into place, and I'm just going to replace this while loop, because all the code is now intact, and you'll see that I now have one setter for each of the columns. And I'm using the getString method where I know I'm getting back a string, getInt where I know I'm getting an integer, and getDouble when the column is set to the type of real in the SQLite database. Finally, after I set all the column values, I'm adding that data item to my list. And at the end of all the code, I'm returning the data. So now the code in my data source is complete, and I'll go to the main activity class. I'm no longer going to be using the sample data, so I'm going to comment out this bit of code, and then I'll declare a list of data item objects, and this time I'll call it listFromDB, and I'll call mDataSource.getAllItems. Then I'll change my data item adapter, and instead of using the sample data, I'll use listFromDB. I'll go back over to my virtual device and make sure I've totally exited the application. Then I'll come back to Android Studio, and I'll run the application again. And there's the data from the database. And I can tell right away that I'm using the database's version because it's no longer sorted alphabetically. Remember, in my data source class, when I called the getAllItems method, I didn't do anything to sort the data in any particular order. And so it's coming out from the database however it comes out. That's up to the database engine. I'll show you in the next video, though, how to filter and sort the data using other arguments of this query method. The important thing to know, though, is that you've encapsulated all the code for working with the database in one class, the data source class. It's the only class that talks directly to the SQLite OpenHelper class, and you can write as many different methods as you need in your data source class to manage your particular database.